In Essential Task 4.4, we are going to talk about how psychologists evaluate two concepts known as reliability and validity. I recommend a horizontal concept map. The concept map entails the box under reliability and then the boxes under validity. I do want to give you a preview of this, where although we're going to define reliability at the top, the box of reliability has three unique definitions inside. You can do those left to right, horizontally, if you can fit it, or you could do those vertically within that reliability box. And again, just to put this into context, this concept map is related directly to the 4.3 concept map, both of which fall under the large umbrella category of psychometrics. But I will return to the text of the task to allow you to pause the video and copy it down. We'll start, though, by talking about reliability. Essentially, in this concept map, we are going to be talking about the evaluations that are made after an IQ test, a personality test, a driver license test, that determines whether or not the test is actually any good. The first is to ensure that the test is what we call reliable. Reliability is the question about whether or not the test scores are consistent, meaning, will you keep getting the same score regardless of how we manipulate the numbers? And by manipulate the numbers, you'll see these three examples here in a moment. The first is to conduct what's called test-retest reliability, which is the question of whether or not test takers would get basically the same score if they took the test twice. For your personality test, your IQ test regarding your intelligence, an AP exam regarding psychology, in theory, if you sit down and take the test, you should get basically the same score if you just happen to sit there and take it twice. We shouldn't see a dramatic shift in your success on the exam or your score on the exam if you happen to take it twice. That would be a flawed test. It really wouldn't be a good exam. Reliable tests based on test-retest reliability have consistent scores between the first test and the retest. The second way of evaluating reliability is to conduct what we call split half reliability. And it sounds kind of weird, but it literally involves taking the assessment and splitting it in half, often by comparing the evens and odds. In theory, the student's success on the odd questions should be approximately the same as the even questions. Evaluating whether or not there is a consistency between those two would involve what's called split half reliability. So whether that's evens or odds or doing other nature of conducting split half reliability, all of which tests, do I have a consistent exam? The last is to shuffle the order of the questions, perhaps shuffle the option order so that it's the same test, but you're administering different forms or alternate forms of the same test. In theory, the order of the questions and the order of the multiple choice options should have no effect whatsoever on performance. Students should score basically the same regardless of that. Evaluating whether or not different forms yield different results is a third measure of reliability. At the end of the day, if you take the same test twice, you should get basically the same score. At the end of the day, you should be able to split the evens and the odds and get about the same. And finally, we should be able to shuffle the exam order up, and you should get basically the same score. Determining any of those three is a measurement of what's called reliability. Will you consistently get the same score every time, regardless of how we manipulate the numbers? And we would use correlation to determine this. So we would take the first test, we would take the retest, and hopefully those two scores are correlated. We wouldn't want you to see some type of dramatic shift between your first and second testing of the exact same test. We would want the evens and odds. We'd want those numbers to be correlated. The better you do on the evens, the better you do on the odds, and vice versa. We wouldn't want some type of weak correlation between any of these measurements. That would be an issue. If we found out there was a very weak correlation between Form A and Form B, and they're just the exact same questions in a different order, that means your test is flawed. As a mnemonic here, the way I look at it is I really isolate the letter R. With reliability, there are three ways we measure it. We either redo the test, we rip it in half. I'm going to do these out of order. So we either redo the same test, take it twice, we rip it in half, which is split half, or we redesign it and administer it a second time. In any of those cases, if the correlation between the two exams or the split halves of the exam or the different forms of the exam are strong, that means we have a reliable test. That means the scores that you get when taking that test are consistent and similar. And that's huge. If any of these numbers are out of whack, you have a completely flawed exam. The other question, though, is if a test is valid. That's a whole different ballgame, because you can actually have a test that's reliable but not valid. Validity is the question, does the test actually measure what it claims it measures? So, for example, when you pass a driver's license application exam and you take the driving test, in theory, if that test is valid, it means you should be able to drive at least fairly well enough to do it safely at least. If you pass that exam and you have no ability to drive whatsoever, that's a huge flaw. We would say that that driving test was invalid. If you pass the AP psychology exam, you should know at least a relatively decent amount of psychology. If you pass the AP psychology exam and you know nothing about psychology, that AP psych exam is not valid because it's claiming to test introductory psych knowledge. If you pass a pilot exam, you should be able to fly and do so safely. If you pass a pilot exam and cannot fly at all, well, then obviously that pilot exam was not valid because although you passed it, it didn't do what it claimed it measured. In each of these cases, in theory, if you pass the exam, there is a clear skill or knowledge that you should possess or be able to demonstrate. And if that doesn't connect, well, then the test simply wasn't valid. Validity is the question, does the test evaluate what it claims to test? There are 3 different types of validity. This is the conclusion of the concept map. But there are 3 different ways we evaluate validity, similar to the 3 different ways we evaluate reliability. The first way that we measure validity is through what's called criterion-related validity, and that term itself has 2 subcategories. So notice we're about to proceed to the bottom left box, and how that word include there is in the middle in large yellow font. The first and really the most practical way of determining criterion-related validity is to take the score on the test, of pilot exam, driving test, AP Psych test, and find another test, a totally different test or different measurement, and see whether or not they're correlated to each other. The most practical one is what we call predictive validity. As we alluded to the other day, the SAT claims to evaluate whether or not each student is going to succeed in college. It tries to evaluate, does this student possess the skills necessary to succeed in college? Well, how are we going to test that? Well, we're going to take your SAT score and we're going to find another measure of that question, your actual college GPA. And we're going to see whether or not your performance in the future does in fact correlate to your SAT score. Because at the end of the day, the SAT is predicting the future. It is claiming to predict your performance in school. So what's the best way of judging that? To run that correlation. We'll take your SAT score, we'll take your future GPA, and hopefully there is a positive correlation between those two. The higher your GPA, the higher your SAT, and vice versa. And that is precisely what we have found. We have found that the SAT does have what's called predictive validity. Your SAT score does positively correlate with your future GPA. In that case, we consider this underneath the category of criterion related because we're taking the SAT and we're correlating it to another measure of the material. In this case, it's clearly future material. With the term predictive, of course, we are predicting the future, thus the word predict as a mnemonic. So another example, let's say you pass a pilot aptitude test. That test would be designed to determine if you have the skills necessary to become a pilot. Not if you are a pilot, not if you can fly, just do you possess, whether it's the processing speed, whether it's the dexterity, whatever it might be, do you possess the skills necessary to fly in the future? One way of measuring that would be to see your score on this test and then follow up with those test takers 5 years later and see how many hours they've flown safely. In theory, if you pass that exam, it should positively correlate to the amount of safe flying hours in the future. That would make logical sense. That typically is the case. That is an example of predictive validity. Exams in this class, AP Psych, demonstrate predictive validity, and I've measured this a few times, where I've taken all of your in-class assessments and I've correlated it to your AP exam score, and I found generally a pretty strong correlation, anywhere from like 0.7 to around 0.85, indicating that your performance on in-class assessments generally does predict the future. And I'm, in that case, running criterion-related validity. I'm taking your in-class assessments, like let's say the midterm, and I'm looking at that score, and then I'm waiting to see in the future how you do on the AP exam, and I'm seeing whether or not the midterm predicted the AP exam, and I'm running a correlation between the two to determine, does my midterm do what it claims to do? In theory, I want my midterm to predict how you're going to do in the class, or at least to approximate how you're going to do on the AP exam. And I think it generally does a pretty good job of that. It does a decent job predicting the future. In that case, I'm finding one material and comparing it to something in the future. Anytime you have a test and then look towards the future to compare it to something else, you're essentially running what's called predictive validity, which falls under the umbrella of criterion related. The other example is to do what's called concurrent validity. Concurrent validity is a simple one where you take a test in one topic designed by one person, and in theory, if you could pass that test, you should be able to pass other tests on the same topic. If there is a difference in your success between those two assessments, there could be a flaw in one of those test designs. So, for example, on May 11th, you should be able to pass, or May 12th this year, you should be able to pass the AP Psych exam, and you should be able to pass the final of introductory psychology in college. Because in theory, the AP Psych exam claims to measure your knowledge of intro psych. Therefore, if I found you a test on intro psych, you should be able to do equally as well on both. Additionally, if you were to be able to pass my US2 World War I exam, you should be able to pass other teachers' World War I exams, whether that's Mr. Rutledge or anybody else, Mr. Solomon, etc. Because in theory, if my World War I exam is valid and their World War I exam is valid, you should do equally as well on all of those exams. If there is a huge discrepancy between performance, then somebody has a flawed test. There's an issue somewhere along the line. Concurrent validity is the question. Can you currently pass two tests designed by two different people on the same topic? If the test that you're designing, if you find out that people that pass your test can't pass other history tests or can't pass other psychology tests, that indicates that your exam, or maybe perhaps that exam, is invalid. It doesn't actually measure what it claims to measure. We call that concurrent validity, and when I look at the name, it kind of looks like the phrase can currently, and then I think of the phrase, can I currently pass two history exams made by two people or two psych exams made by two different teachers? The next remaining one is what we call content validity. This one's a little bit more informal, but it involves showing your assessment to experts in the field and seeing whether or not they agree it does a good job assessing the material. So it's not as stat-driven. We're not crunching correlations anymore. We're not comparing test results. It's a little bit more informal. So, for example, we might show the AP US History exam to history teachers and see whether or not college professors agree this does a decent job evaluating the US 1 material, or the US history material covered in college in introduction history. Does a psychologist teacher agree that the AP exam does a decent job evaluating psych? That's what we call content validity. Would experts generally agree it does a decent job, or does it sway too heavily towards one unit or one material or one concept over others? The final one is also a little informal, but it's something that you definitely consider when you're looking at the questions. If you've ever answered a question on a multiple choice section and felt like the question was unfair because it was asking something unrelated to the test material, you could critique that assessment based on what's called construct validity. Construct validity is the question about whether or not the test is constructed to assess only what it's intending on questioning. So, for example, in a few units, we're going to talk about a study involving rhesus monkeys, this little cute monkey here in the bottom left corner. I could ask you a bunch of questions about the assessment itself, but if I asked you on a multiple choice question, what kind of monkey was in the study? Well, that would be unfair. This isn't zoology class. This is a psychology class. The type of monkey in the study really is totally meaningless unless I tell you otherwise. That would be a question that lacks validity. How could I ask you about monkeys on an AP psychology exam? That would indicate a flaw in the test design. That would indicate that my test lacked construct validity. So you shouldn't see any philosophy on your geography exams. You shouldn't see any geometry on your algebra. I guess I don't think so. You shouldn't see any psychology on your chemistry. You shouldn't see any Spanish on your Italian. You really should only see questions on the intended topic. The second the questions start to stray off into unrelated areas, that test is invalid and it no longer assesses what it claims to assess.